Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion run by MAC titled Experimentations Inform Writing Memoir, which is a satellite event running alongside the launch of our new memoir by Stephen Shaw titled Modern Instances, The Craft of Photography. My name is Liv Constable-Maxwell and I'm from MAC, and I'm thrilled today to introduce our three wonderful panelists, all of whom have contributed to the form of life writing, autobiography and memoir in exciting ways. Lynne Tillman's recent novel is Men and Apparitions, nominated for a Republic of Consciousness Prize, and her most recent story collection is The Complete Madame Realism and Other Stories. Her non-fiction books include The Velvet Years, Warhol's Factory, 1965 to 67, with photographs by Stephen Shaw, and What Would Lynne Tillman Do?, finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Her novella Weird Fucks was published in the UK by Peninsula Press. She lives in New York with bass player David Hofstra. Next is Andrea Palato, who's an artist based in Rochester, New York. She's published 3 books, including Who Is Changed and Who Is Dead, A Spectacle and Nothing Strange, and East of the Sun, West of the Moon. Andrea is exhibited at Silver Eye Center for Photography in Pittsburgh, the Aperture Foundation in New York, and the Swiss Institute in Milan. She's an exhibition opening in May in Bologna, Italy. And finally, Juliet Jacques, who's a writer and filmmaker based in London. She's published 3 books, including Trams, a memoir, and a short story collection titled Variations. Her essays, criticism, and journalism have appeared in many publications, from the London Review of Books to Tribune, and her short films have screened in galleries and festivals worldwide. She teaches at the Royal College of Art and elsewhere. Her upcoming book is titled Frontlines, Trans Journalism, and is due from Cypher Press in July 2022. So, I think to begin, we've spoken about feelings of resistance to the term memoir, and I'd be curious to know, the different terms in which you found to speak about memoir and to speak about your autobiographical works.
It's something I come up with in photography a lot. And it's funny as a teacher, like just seeing how many times I've been asked, like other students, they're hearing, like, is it true? Did that happen? Did you, like, people are really invested in whether something actually happened. And it's so interesting to me. Like I have just kind of stopped making any like mental demarcation between truth or fiction or nonfiction, and like kind of all, I maybe journalism and photojournalism aside, but like in any writing or photography, like I have little interest in this idea of made or found or truth. It's really kind of, to me, I think about like how the project is best like conveying a fidelity to its experience. And that fidelity could be like totally a moment of magical realism. And if that is what does it, that makes that your audience be able to understand like the gravity or the poignancy or the something of whatever you're trying to share, like that to me doesn't feel, that emotional fidelity doesn't feel any less real to me. Can
I ask something?
Yeah, please.
I mean, it's absolutely true that people ask you, did this really happen? Did you experience this? Did you? And I just wonder why. What?
That's a good question. It's funny. I Liv, in one of her questions was like, what's the psychological implication of memoir? And one of the things that I thought when I was thinking about that is that the psychological implication, when you know that something has happened, is that so if the reader thinks it's happened, it's like subsequently it could happen again. And perhaps it could happen to you, the reader. Right. And so it's kind of almost like this impetus to like understand an experience that you may potentially have to encounter or may not want to encounter. Like I have a good friend who had to put down Anne Boyer's The Undying, which is an account of her experience with breast cancer, because she felt, and she said this to me, the book was giving her cancer. Right. So there was this superstition to this, that book is super direct, super like, I don't know if you guys have read it. It would definitely has a dialogue with your new book, Lynn, but like it's so direct and so intense. And she was so able to viscerally imagine herself in that experience that was true that it became, you know, a psychological impact on her. And I think that we do tend to relegate things that we deem to be fantasy or, you know, unreal to kind of things that couldn't happen to us, which is crazy to me because the real world is just as fantastical and, you know, unreal as the made up world could ever be in so many ways. Sorry, I don't know if that's a real answer to your question, but just a thought.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it does. And I think the reduction of fiction to what is untrue has been a sad commentary since in America, I think, since the 1980s with Reagan, and the question of imagination being a problem. You know, things that are imagined in any sense have their own reality. But, you know, on television this is based on a true story. Well, true is also what fiction can do or what photography can do. And it's very different from talking about an actual event, and that event may be rendered terribly so that it doesn't really matter that it happened. Juliet, I was just
Yeah, no, I wanted to come in there. I am really interested in this category of autofiction, and it was a field I wanted to work in, to be honest. I mean, I said earlier that I'm not a huge fan of memoir and don't really tend to read it, but I've really enjoyed works over the last sort of decade or so by Sheila Heti, Chris Kraus, Lars Eier, Jean-Philippe Toussaint, and others that sort of complicate. They're all marketed as fiction, they're all bracketed as fiction, but they complicate the line between fiction and sort of memoir, autobiography, and kind of make a bit of a game out of, you know, giving the central character the same forename, at least, as the author, having some sort of recognizable details from the author's life in the narrative. And the game for the reader is to sort of establish perhaps what's true, what's invented, and whether or not that distinction matters. And I think in all the cases I've mentioned there, the stakes are quite low, really. You know, in Sheila Heti's How Should a Person Be, Chris Kraus's I Love Dick, something like Jean-Philippe Toussaint's Self-Portrait Abroad has a chapter called The Best Day of My Life, and it's about winning a bowls tournament with his friends. And Lars Eier's Spurious trilogy, kind of the whole premise of those books is that these two philosophy lecturers who, you know, are struggling to deal with their disappointment, living at a time when what they're doing feels so low stakes. With my writing, because I was sort of writing in a time and place where anything I wrote really would still be taken as representative of the entire trans community, and so kind of making a sort of clever game out of, you know, whether or not these experiences of institutional and social transphobia happened to me or not, didn't really feel like the appropriate thing to do with that material. And I had to stick not just to a sort of literary or poetic truth or a sort of truthfulness in saying, look, these are experiences that happened to trans people in Britain in the early 21st century, but also a sort of literal truth for me as much as possible. There was still some creative license in terms of writing dialogue and how I ordered the events, and we can come back to that in a bit. But, you know, I couldn't just sort of invent anecdotes or borrow things that happened to other people. I was very interested in the writing of this book, and in the run up to writing it, I was very interested in Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, another trans author, which came out in 1993. There's quite a lot of ambiguity about how autobiographical that was, and Feinberg said contradictory things at contradictory times, but delivered quite an interesting interview a few years after the book was published that said, look, by writing this as fiction, I actually felt I could say a lot more about the sort of experience for like trans masculine people in the US before the Stonewall Rebellion, because Feinberg said, look, you know, if you write autobiographically as a trans person, you're told to strip or be stripped, and that by accepting the big lie of calling something fiction, you could actually be a lot more truthful poetically and literally, I think.
Yeah.
So that really interested me.
And I think what was, Julia, I read in an interview that you did about you kind of having this push and pull about, the kind of social pressures of confession and of this kind of truth telling versus this kind of very genuine and existential kind of feeling of care towards younger people in the trans community. And I think it seems that, Lynne and Mothercare, for instance, and Andrea in your book, that sense of like the duty of care there and that kind of like caregiving role that you can take on as a truth teller feels quite important. And Lynne, you very explicitly write about that you're kind of writing this in order to help people and help people kind of going through something similar. And I kind of wanted to, I was kind of interested to ask about that.
I think, Liv, that I'd rather think about writing honestly than being a truth teller, because I would not want to take on the burden of that very big idea of truth with a capital T.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be true to myself and to the reader. I don't want to disguise my own culpability or contradictions or whatever. I can sometimes smell a book that's dishonest, and you could just feel that the writer is covering herself. To me, at least, to say that I tell the truth in my book would mean that there's no other way that these events could be seen. Now, I have two older sisters. The book isn't about them. They appear in it, but they're not major figures. The bigger figure is my mother and the incidents that happened over those 11 years, and my relationship to having a mother who is dependent, not liking my mother, and so on, and my relationship and thinking about death and a lot of other things. So I feel that honesty is maybe the hardest thing to describe, really. But I can feel in writing when the author is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, when the author is in some way blowing themselves up, and rationalizing and overly rationalizing and leaving no doubt. I guess when I say I'm being honest, I'm not saying that what I have written is the God's honest truth about life, about hospitals, about anything. It's what I've done is try to be honest to myself and to the reader about those experiences.
Absolutely. And so in terms of, going back to this honesty and how that relates to a kind of feeling of a duty of care to your audience and this kind of idea of caregiving, Juliet and Andrea, how do you feel that resonates with your work?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my memoir and my Guardian blog specifically because I felt there was just a real absence of information for people, and particularly by the time I did that in the early to mid 2010s, there wasn't really an obvious starting point on these issues. There was quite a lot of information scattered around the internet, a lot of it North American, and I wanted to write something specifically for a British context. But going back even further than that, I talked earlier about Section 28 and the lack of resources I had growing up. And, I did have in my head writing the memoir, I just thought, what would the 15, 16-year-old me have wanted? What sort of book would they have needed? And then wrote that. So yeah, absolutely. Those questions were uppermost in my mind, really.
And what about you, Andrea?
I guess I think of it like that, like a weird combination of what was just said. Like the best form of caretaking for others would be to create something that had the most fidelity and specificity to your own experience. like, I've been asked this question a couple times about my book, like, how did you write with like universality in mind of like connecting to like other moms? I'm like, well, I didn't actually, or like other kids who were raised by mentally ill parents. Well, like, I didn't think of them either. Like, I basically just thought, like, well, what's the most vulnerable I feel comfortable being? I'm going to be that. And I'm not going to mince words. I'm going to be really direct and straightforward, because that's just kind of how I am as a person in general. And I'm going to try to be as specific to my experience as I can possibly be. And in that way, those who connect to it, I think, will connect with a greater poignancy, because there's more to kind of pull onto, I think. Like, I don't know, this is like maybe like a slightly roundabout example, but also as a teacher a lot in photography, like a lot of times, I'm always editing artist statements and project descriptions. And I can't count the number of times that I have students who will reference something super vague, childhood trauma, like no specific. This is about my exploration of trauma. And in my head, I'm just kind of like, you like literally have given me nothing. There's no way I could connect to this, right? And so for me, I didn't want to do that. I knew I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to be really specific. These are the things that have happened that made me feel the way I feel and have formed me, into making this body of work. And I think that was like how I thought of caretaking, like just being honest and direct about my experiences and not trying to flourish them or like sugarcoat them or be vague about them. I don't know.
I think what we're all saying is that being specific, which, in any fiction writing course, you're told, be specific, but using oneself is a form of specificity, I suppose, and then through that, people identify. You don't identify, with trauma per se. You identify with these specifics. And even if they're not yours, what they do is they register, and then there are associations to them that people reading connect with. I too started this mother care. I thought it would be helpful. I mean, I'd just gone through 11 years of what I felt was horrific and very difficult in many, many ways. And I thought I've learned something from this. And I don't know if this is what writers want to do or artists generally want to do, but use the experience. And I thought it would be helpful for others to see how this one family or one person navigated this mysterious terrain. You don't know what you're getting into when someone gets very ill and is dependent on you.
I mean, Lynn, also one thing I thought was super interesting for me about your book was that you don't actually, I mean, there are clues, there's like foreshadowing, but you don't actually come out and say, I dislike my mother until like about page 40. So you've already established this like precedence of caretaking. And it made me realize how often we assume that people are caretaking out of love. And it really complicated, kind of like your unsentimentality about it really complicated the notion of caretaking for me and made me think of all of the kind of guilt and obligation and other reasons that we take on caretaking roles that actually don't have to do with wanting to do them or loving the person that we're doing them for. And I thought that was really kind of an interesting subversive element to not give it to us directly, actually, to kind of pull us into this narrative of caretaking and then kind of hit us with that fact. That was, yeah.
Thank you.
And Juliet, actually, in terms of specificity, one thing I really loved about trans was how, and I don't know, people talk to you about this a lot already, but how I felt like your your memoir enacted as, it was as important to you what you were listening to and what films you were watching when you wrote that. And I really love this idea of how like we're formed culturally by our experiences and our aesthetic preferences and not just like by our personal lived experience. I thought that that was really amazing. And there's so many instances where you talk about a movie and and music, and like it really kind of, not that it set the stage, but it just showed like how we're a collection of all these things. It actually made me think of I know you don't like memoir, but have you read Annie Arnaud's The Years?
I have, yeah, and that's quite an interesting, that calls itself a collective memoir, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I thought the word collective memoir was interesting in your more recent book too, which is kind of like a collective historical memoir too, in some ways, right? Like an amalgamation of all these stories to become like a story, a personal story.
I mean,
get all your books. I want to get all your books desperately now.
Same. I mean, there's Andrea, there's so much I could say to that. I mean, The Years, I'd like to talk about The Years for a moment, actually. I think it's really interesting that you brought that up. I found that very interesting. I was a bit suspicious of the narrative voice. Maybe it's my person. Well, yeah, maybe it's my exposure to like terrible opinion journalists in Britain who constantly use "we did this, we did that, we think this," and I always just think, speak for yourself, mate. And I found that with Erno to an extent, there's this constant kind of we consumed this and we reacted like this to that, and yeah, I kind of thought, I don't know, I see the project as a sort of personalized national history, and there was a lot about that narrative that I really related to. But I kind of thought, look, who is this we? Who is included in it? Who is excluded from it? So I had that suspicion. But yeah, I mean, Lynne, you were talking earlier about specificity. And what I was trying to do in my memoir, because I was writing about the very specific experience of transition, gender reassignment through hormones and surgery, obviously that's a very specific experience to a very small subset of the population. But this process of discovering yourself through culture, through popular and, in my case, often not very popular culture. And I think, that's relatable. I talked a lot about how helpful the Smiths were to me as a teenager, as sort of, alienated, white, crucially, teenager in like a small suburban town in England in the 90s. And lots of people can relate to that, I think, even if they don't like the Smiths, but had a similar relationship to different cultural artifacts. And obviously I do a lot of cultural criticism as well, and really wanted to bring that into the book. So yeah, and a lot of people, I mean, some readers found that quite frustrating. Said they wondered why, when they were reading a memoir, they were so often reading about people who weren't me. And I think that partly reflects, my reticence and ambivalence about writing about myself, and the fact that I was doing so as part of a much wider political project of sort of trans representations, of opening up a wider conversation. But it also, speaks to the fact that I feel that, we do all form our identities. No one forms their identity in a vacuum or alone, or even in a small circle, really.
Right. And that's it's interesting, very interesting that would be a response. Why would you bring in these cultural objects when, of course, how do we exclude them from our formations? I mean, we are formed inside systems, and media and different aspects of culture are just part of, I was 3 when I started watching television, so
it is. I mean, I didn't, it's funny, Julia, I thought of it kind of as like a literary strategy to take something that was like kind of hyper specific to a small population and kind of mirror back on a larger population to kind of speak about how we're how everyone is cobbled together in some form, not to minimize the actual experience, but do you know what I mean? To kind of open it up and like create an entry point for those of us who wouldn't have had that specific experience, but to kind of speak to this construction and performance of self in these ways that we could relate to. Wasn't annoyed at it.
Good. I don't think I could have put that better.
Which is why I is such an important pronoun, because anyone can be, you know, obviously it's a shifter, and anyone can take on I. You know, I think in poetry it's seen very differently, but in fiction or prose, I think the use of I invites the reader to be that I also.
And I was interested, Juliet, in something that you wrote about how it was only when you started interviewing your friends about the period when you were in the kind of record label that you started thinking about yourself as a character in your memoir. And I think that, you know, again, thinking about the resistance that you've just described of people kind of not really being sure of why you're including the Smiths, for instance, kind of speaks to a very kind of specific literary like precedent of what a memoir should be. And so I'm wondering about, you know, on the one hand, you know, how do you kind of write as an I within that literary precedent? And then also, how do you subvert that? And I know, Andrea, you kind of, when we were kind of writing before this, you spoke about a kind of real interest in having the kind of confessional mode as a way of being very subversive. And I sort of wondered if we could speak a bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I thought it was interesting. Juliet wanted to talk about like kind of the pressure and the problem of confession. And I think that that's interesting too. I mean, I think that the use of the word confession is generally meant to imply a crime or a sin. And so it's implicit in the word is that the confessor has done something wrong, which can be, you know, particularly problematic in relation to women who are historically have been made to feel badly about and punished for things that are essentially just human, or that men have not been or are not punished for. But I also think that like this idea of a confession can be really interesting. And so for me, like the idea of a subversive memoir, or how confession could become a tool for subversion is, I think it's kind of like saying things that are hard to say, or that aren't generally said, or that people don't want to hear. And so, for instance, like in Lynne's book about talking, just kind of being so straightforward about not wanting to, being so happy to walk away from her mom's apartment and being so grateful to relinquish care. Like those are all things that I could relate to as a mom, for sure. Like, and the burden of caretaking, but they're, you know, they're not commonly said, and they're not commonly said by women who are generally assume that they will take on these caretaking roles and should, and in fact have maybe even been born to do them, or it's the most important thing they'll do. And so to kind of just own that you don't want to do that, to me, that felt really subversive. And then like actually funnily going back to Annie Ernaux, I don't know if you guys have also read Simple Passion, just like another book of hers. It came immediately to mind for a total opposite reason of Lynne's book. It's a story of a 2-year affair that she had with a married man who didn't live in her town. And in the book, like when he calls to like say he's going to come see her that evening, she will just recant her day leading up to the visit by like, she'll go buy new clothes, new lingerie, she'll clean her apartment, she'll fix herself up. And it's funny, they're all things that traditionally no one would be surprised to hear a woman doing for a man. But the fact that she has no pretense about her neediness and her desire and her obsession, or I mean, I basically feel like pretense makes the world go round. And I like was cringing when I read that she spent the day by the phone. I was like, oh God, I'm like gonna, you know, throw up in my mouth. This is so intense. But the fact that she just owned that, like that was enough. And she would just wait by the phone. That actually felt really subversive to me too, because I feel like there is this idea of like this mirage around femininity that like women are supposed to do these things, but it's like, you don't really like, you're not really supposed to admit to being vain. You're just supposed to look beautiful, or like, you're not supposed to try. You're like, and so I don't know, I guess, sorry, I'm rambling a lot, but both of those things felt really subversive to me in Lynne's book and in that other book, in Simple Passion, in like kind of opposite ways of revealing things that people would be surprised to hear maybe.
thinking as you're talking about the question of shame
Mm.
and how shame operates. And often it's about the body. For instance, to use a gross or crass example, I think someone would rather admit to slapping their child, say, than to having farted in a restaurant. And when you think about it, I mean, that may be an exaggeration or it may not be. I don't know. But the things that our bodies do involuntarily also, or attitudes toward breastfeeding, for instance, in different cultures, but, you know, having to hide the breast. And there's so much about the body. And this is why I'm eager to read Juliet's book and books and see your work about mothering. And there's so much that we feel we have to hide that is related to the body, like Annie Arnaud, fixing her body, you know, in order to remain attractive to her married lover. And men are not supposed to be doing that. But of course, in more recent years, you know, 30, 40 years, they're getting plastic surgery. Their eyebrows are being, you know, shaped and so on. And I think some men will write honestly about that at some point. And this is all kinds of men, all kinds of sexualities and genders. It's the question of vanity and narcissism in our species is, well, it's not a question, it exists, you know, it exists.
Definitely. And I guess thinking, kind of continuing with that idea of, you know, shame in relation to memoir, what do you do as a writer writing autobiographically when you're met with that feeling of shame? How do you move through it? Do you avoid it? What's the process there?
I just wanted to, I'll continue about the shame thing. In writing Mother Care, I had to contend with the fact that all of my mother's companions were people of color, and some were undocumented immigrants. And this to me is shameful, that we used a system that allowed us to do that because we couldn't afford to pay people who were US citizens, for one thing. I think a couple of times there were US citizens, but always of color. And writing about this was, in a way, the hardest part of the book. I don't know that this could ever be gotten right, but I tried to be honest about my complicity without using a lot of those jargony words. I don't think I use the word complicity. And I write at one point that, because this is a book also that's about ethics, and I say at one point, if I felt so strongly about this ethically, I would have lived with my mother and given up the rest of my life because I did not want to hire women of color or undocumented immigrants, but I didn't do that. And do I feel ashamed about that? There's some shame, yes. But, you know, one rationalizes. I didn't want to give up my life, you know. It's a conundrum, and it's a system in which we live that is certainly unequal and inequitable.
Absolutely. And so I guess moving on slightly from that would be an idea about just to kind of think more broadly about the kind of other half of the title of this discussion, which is Experimentations in Form. And I wanted to ask, I guess, Andrea, you first and foremost about working between image and text. And I know, Lynne, also you kind of write to images and write alongside images a lot in your work. Juliet as a filmmaker, and I kind of was just interested in how that relationship across the mediums works when thinking about autobiography and kind of life writing or life making.
Sure. So for me, kind of coming into this as a photographer, I think generally, there are more common categories would be word books with some pictures or picture books with some words, but it's kind of less common where you find a project where text and image are meant to kind of pull equal weight. And for me, I struggle with that. I think that there's a tradition in photography, this idea that, if the photos are good enough, they don't need words. And so I had a bit of apprehension about the fact that I wanted to put words in. Historically, my other projects I had always had a writer, a written component, but they were always written by other people. And this was really the first time that I knew I needed to do the writing, that there were really kind of specific stories and anecdotes that only I could tell. And it wasn't until I was casually having a conversation with a friend who referenced my project as being hybridic. And that it was like some dorky semantic light bulb went off in my head, where I had been kind of trying to parse out these fragments and keep them to a minimum. How much is someone really going to want to read in a photo book? And when he said that, I was just kind of had a no duh moment, it's just actually not a photo book anymore. And I can write as much as I want to fucking write in this book. It doesn't matter anymore. And that was really, really liberating. And so then the next question would be well, what do I want the relationship to be between the text reality and the image reality? And that is always really tricky. I think a lot, I really don't like when bodies of work kind of have what I would call a mirror relationship between text and image. I find it I don't need to see two things the same way through different mediums. So for me, it's about, what kind of tributary route can this take to come back to the whole, as opposed to just I don't know if that makes sense. I don't want to get the same thing in words and the same thing in pictures. I want them to be an extension of each other and grow each other, but not illustrate or repeat each other. And so I kind of played around with going back to the idea of how many holes can you have before you something doesn't connect anymore. I was really interested in kind of playing with that. So in my book, for instance, there are images that relate to specific anecdotes or things that I'm writing about. And sometimes they actually relate, it's a picture of the thing, but they're never juxtaposed immediately. So the viewer always kind of has to hold I think of my structure, jokingly in my head, as a constellation or a spider web. In terms of a structure, you always kind of have to hold something and then kind of connect the point back to the image or back to the text and kind of trust me that it does indeed connect back and it isn't just malarkey that there for no reason. And so, there's these moments where I'm talking about we're living in the Caribbean and I'm talking about this fear of my daughter getting bitten by a poisonous bug or eating these poisonous berries. And then I have these still lives with bugs and these still lives with these fruits. And they're not the literal fruits or the literal bugs that I'm writing about. It's more kind of, meant to talk about just this general idea that the everyday world could become a threat rather than illustrating the facts of the story specifically. There's only one point in the book where the image and the text do correlate, and that was specifically what I did to solve that problem of censorship that we had when we were making the book. And so Juliet and Lynne, I had my book has some naked pictures of my children who are both females, both daughters in it, and there were two images that had been asked to be removed for distribution in some countries. And I was trying to figure out how I wanted to handle it. And my book talks a lot about theoretical threats based around gender and theoretical sexualization of the female body. And so I decided that it actually could be really interesting to play forward this thing that was theoretical, that was now no longer theoretical, and put it into the book itself. And so the way I solved that was I traced a picture. I traced the picture that was asked to be removed, and then photographed the trace. And I wanted to make it a trace because it specifically, I wanted to speak to a referent of something that had been there that was no longer there, rather than just say a drawing. And so
the palimpsest.
and so in that moment in the book, the image and the text correlate, but it's the only moment where that happens. And so for me, it was, thanks. Thanks.
That's the one.
And so I think it was just kind of, I just really kind of had to be razor sharp in terms of editing out things that I felt were essentially doing double duty to solve that idea of text and image. Like, if I'm saying this with a photo, I don't need to say it with words. And I wanted to reinforce rather than repeat, I guess, maybe. Sorry to ramble again.
No, that's perfect. I think we probably have time for one more, because I don't want to keep everyone longer than necessary. But I mean, maybe to kind of finish, I want to take a quote that Lynne, you said in a book forum piece, which is about what makes a good memoirist. And you've written, a good memoirist must also find meanings outside herself, beyond the limits of subjectivity. For personal memories to count, they will not only be written with emotional vividness, retrospective vision, and intelligence, they will also reach for truths others can inhabit. And so I guess just to finish, I just wanted to ask for you all, what makes a good memoirist, in your opinion?
Well, I'll go. I mean, I guess it would come down to me to maybe the ideas around vulnerability. And I think that vulnerability can be a form of generosity to your audience. And I think in terms of what the quote you just read from Lynne, I think that ability to be vulnerable does help your audience identify and inhabit those truths that you're speaking about that are totally subjective, and are still subjective, but allow like an entry point into them. And not different from what Juliet's doing with like all of these things that anyone could connect to, just the problematics of growing up and becoming a person without knowing her specific experience, right? So it's like I mean, it's dorky, but I think that the personal is political, and I think that the personal does extend past the personal if you do it. I don't want to say right or correct, but you know what I mean? There's a way to make that extension and that connection to others, even if your story is super niche or specific or whatnot. And I think that a good memoirist is someone who's able to do that for their audience, to let them inhabit a space, even if it's not a space they've ever come close to like actually literally inhabiting in their life.
And I think all of us in some way are engaged with the reverse of that, which is that the political is personal, that the way in which trans is thought of, the way in which motherhood is thought of, the way in which caregiving is thought of. These are not our inventions, but we maybe try to interrupt them or
complicate them in the least.
Yeah.
And what about you, Juliet?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I think having some sort of social aim for your memoir writing can be really beneficial, and that can range from sort of more concrete things like, I don't know, I want to advocate for, at least implicitly, a change in healthcare provision, or just sort of advocate for just more social understanding and acceptance of certain ways of being in the world. And I think these are things that can really help memoir just move beyond solipsism or self-aggrandizement or self-servitude. And I think what Andrea says about vulnerability, I think, really ties into that. But yeah, that would be my primary concern, really.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think we should probably wrap up. But yeah, thank you.
I just want to say it was so great talking with you guys. Wonderful.
I could talk about this all night.
Well,
I could see
Some
something.
wine, a Smiths album.
careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
But no, thank you all so much, and that was really, really fascinating and such a pleasure.
And Meta's Murder's the best one, by the way.
Yes. Well, that can be a separate panel discussion. We can do one of the Smiths album.
Did Mac publish your book?
Yes.
That's what I want.
It's en route to you. It should have arrived with you. So, but yeah, thank you so much, and
Thank you.
thank you everyone for joining, who's watching.
Bye.
And yeah, speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take
Be
care.
well.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Well.
So we were just talking about truth telling, and
yes.
you were describing how you feel that you can tell when someone is being dishonest.
Yes.
And I was maybe going to ask if you could just clarify what you mean by the difference between kind of truthfulness and what's true. I was